Public Safety at DCJS. I first want to take an opportunity to thank all of you for being here for the last 3 days. We know your time is very valuable, and we appreciate you coming here. I think it's quite evident that it's a commitment to your craft and your profession that you took 3 days out of your own time to be here and to learn along with us. I wanted to also take an opportunity to thank the staff, Chuck, Ray, and Anthony for doing all the hard work to get this going. We hope you've enjoyed it. As Mike Wood said yesterday, we take this very seriously, and we want to make sure we're performing and getting you what you need. So please, please provide us feedback. We take it very seriously. We look at it, and we try to adjust to make sure that this is providing for all of you the most important experience and most that you can get out of it. I'm so pleased to be here this morning with you to introduce Chief Lou Dekmar from the Lagrange Police Department. I won't go into his bio in too much detail. You have it in there. But Chief Dekmar has had a long and distinguished career with over 42 years in law enforcement. In addition to being the chief, he's been committed to working with others to continually strengthening the policing profession throughout his role as the past president of the IACP and his work with CALEA. He's been a leader in the movement to help strengthen trust-building relationships and partnerships with local communities through acknowledgement of past harms, and we're so pleased that he's able to join us here at the symposium to speak with all of you on this subject. At the end of his presentation, there's going to be a few minutes for questions, and we have mics down here and down here. So at that time, please come up to the mics and you can ask questions and he'll take it over. But turn it over to Chief Dekmar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. So, about a year after Ferguson, I'm getting off a plane and I see a USA Today newspaper and a banner headline, and it says, "Public confidence in police at 20-year low." So I pick up the USA Today and I'm reading it while I'm waiting on my bags, and sure enough, if you compare Gallup poll, and this was a Gallup poll, if you compare it the year before Ferguson to the year after Ferguson, we went from a 62% public confidence level to a 51% confidence level. So I get back to the office and I pull up the whole poll, and sure enough, we had dropped to 51. That same poll, it looked at 16 institutions. President Obama was at 44%, the U.S. Supreme Court was at 32%, the media was at 19%, big business 18%, and Congress at 9%. And so I thought, good gosh, our worst year in 20 years, and we still have relatively high confidence level. And so as a student of our profession, I had to ask myself, what are those things that contribute to that? And one of those, I believe, and it's unique to the United States, not solely the United States, but certainly I think we are the most pronounced, is we have over 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Most countries have a handful. I attended the chief constable meeting in England, 43 counties, roughly the size of Wisconsin, 60 million population, they have 43 police departments. One of the things that they were carrying on about in frustration was we have too many police departments. And I said, y'all are kidding. I said, I'm from Georgia. We have over 700 with a population of 11 million. And I say all that to say this. I think the reason that we maintain a relatively, generally speaking, general poll is because 75% of our agencies have 50 officers or less. 50% of our agencies have 25 or less, and 25% of our agencies have 10 officers or less. So by and large, we know our community, and our community knows us. They identify with us. Now that's true as it relates to general polls, but then as I scratch down deeper into that poll and I start looking at those results based on race, and this is consistent with almost every poll, and not just in the United States. Canada, for example, if you look at their poll numbers, they're somewhere around, the last time I looked, confidence level of police in Canada was around 48%. The native population confidence level was at 18 to 22%. When I look at our poll for African Americans, and this is consistent because I've deliberately looked at those poll results since I became aware of the huge disparity in confidence between the general poll numbers and marginalized communities. When that poll was put out a year after Ferguson, and we dropped to 51%, in the African American community it was 26%. Within the last year, I saw confidence levels in some polls that were running between 71 and 74%. When I look at the African American segment, excuse me, of that poll, the number's around 51%. So the swing generally is somewhere between 20 to 27%. And as someone that has policed for 42 years and 10 years in Wyoming and 32 years in Georgia, those poll numbers and that disparity between those numbers was not a surprise to me. And that's because I believe that as police chief for 25 years almost in this jurisdiction and another 4 in another jurisdiction, I believe that the relationships that I had created over time had been trusting relationships. And in fact, they had been trusting relationships, but they were at a personal level. And I think oftentimes many of us in institutions think because we have personal relationships, that translates in institutional relationships. And my experience has been that is not the case. In my city, which is probably 48% African American, 44% white, and then the balance Latino and Asian. The 1860 census, there were 128 counties in Georgia. Our county was the 5th largest slaveholding county, so a lot of the folks that are there are former, their relatives are former slaves. Tuskegee, the Tuskegee experiments, the syphilis experiments between 1929 and 1972, where the U.S. Department of Health intentionally withheld medical treatment so they could score, much like you would a guinea pig, the disease as it progressed, sometimes fatally, on African Americans. That jurisdiction is less than an hour from me. The lynchings, next to Mississippi, Georgia had the 2nd largest number of lynchings in the country. So that's the Southern history. And I'm up here in New York, and you're all saying, well, that's your all's problem down there. We don't have those issues. Well, between the late 1800s and 1945 to 1955, there is huge movement of African Americans up north as they fled Jim Crow laws, lynchings, terror, the Klan. And they bring to these venues that they now live the experience that they had in the South. And they bring their understanding of policing, their experience down in the South. And if our officers don't understand the history and don't understand when they go into some of these communities why they're greeted with hostility, frustration, anger, and we react as people do react to those kind of behaviors, without that information, then sometimes we behave in a way that validates what they think about the police generally. And this came home to me, this whole issue of trust, probably at about 2013. One of my captains comes up to me, and our police department's 3 floors. And I imagine it's like many of your police departments, on the wall you got pictures of the old timers from the 20s and 30s and, maybe earlier than that. But she comes in and she goes, you're not going to believe what I just heard in the hallway. And she's African American. And I said, no, what? And she goes, I just passed two elderly black ladies, and as I went by, one of them pointed to one of those historic pictures and said, "They killed our people." Now, this is in 2013. I said, "Do you know what they're talking about?" She said, "I have no idea." So I started doing some research so I could figure out, what they were alluding to. And what I found is that in 1940, 70-some years before they're standing in the hallway on the third floor looking at pictures of old-timers, that in 1940, in September, Lagrange Police Department had arrested a young man by the name of Austin Calloway. And the charge, and this was based on newspaper accounts because I couldn't find a police report, I couldn't find an investigation, I didn't find any follow-up when he was abducted, I didn't find any follow-up when he was discovered lynched. So these are based on newspaper accounts. The Lagrange Police Department arrested him for assault on a white woman. Now, in 1940, a young man being arrested for assault on a white woman could be anything from failing to avert your eyes as you passed a white woman, or not crossing the street so that you shared the same sidewalk, or it could have been a physical assault. I don't know what it was because there was no documentation. But that was how it was characterized in the newspaper accounts. So they arrest him and they trot him down to our city jail, and within about 5 or 6 hours, 5 folks show up in hoods and physically take him from the police. Now, what arguably ought to be the safest place in the world certainly was not for Austin. And they took him out of town and lynched him. He was discovered. He had been shot 5 times. He was discovered he was still alive by the time they got him to the ER. He had died. Now, during that time, the newspaper account locally was very, very small. Just a small column. I think it said, "Young Negro shot and killed," and then a couple of paragraphs. But during that time, there was substantial debate in Congress on a national anti-lynching law to federalize it as a crime. And so the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times were following some of these lynchings in the South because they were making the case, not only on their editorial page, but also on the news accounts, why this law should be passed. Of course, the law was stalled by Southern Democrats, and as a result, that legislation never passed. So, as I'm turning up all this information, I'm also discovering that in the black church where Austin had his funeral, there was a Warren Temple Methodist church. Reverend Strickland had appealed to the local authorities to do something about it, and they, of course, didn't do anything. So he wrote to the NAACP, and so I have some correspondence that I got copies of between him and, at the time, their national legal advisor, who was Thurgood Marshall. And so Thurgood encouraged them to create an NAACP, and Austin's lynching gave birth to our local NAACP. In one of the correspondence, Thurgood Marshall had asked, "Well, have you appealed to the local authorities?" And Reverend Strickland said, "Yes, I have," and their response is they choose to ignore it. And that was pretty much the way those were handled in the South. And I talked to different groups yesterday. I was speaking to our state Supreme Court judges and Superior Court judges and federal judges as part of an award ceremony. And one of the things that I always like to remind other bodies is the police frequently, and in my opinion, more than any other institution, the police, because we've had to, have dealt with this issue more effectively than any other institution. But the other part of history that people seem to forget is legislature passed these laws, communities supported these laws, churches were silent, judges made adjudications and imposed sentences, but the folks that carry the historic load for this is the police. And I understand that, philosophically, I certainly understand, and intellectually why that's the case, because we're out there in front. But there also needs to be, in my opinion, other institutions stepping up and accepting responsibility for these historic harms, which, as I began to consider how to address this, and I'm talking to folks in the white community, I'm talking to folks in the black community, the response I generally get from the loud segment, not the majority, from the loud segment in the white community is, well, I don't know why you're digging this up. I didn't own slaves. My family didn't own slaves. I don't discriminate. I'm not responsible. So, let dead dogs lie. In the black community, because they've seen, so many different runs at programs and initiatives and those sorts of things, the reception in some quarters of the black community was, this is just, another hollow attempt to gloss over history. I look at it as when you come into a leadership position, any of us come into a leadership position of any kind, whether it be with the church, whether it be the DA's office, whether it be with a company. You get the trappings and the honor of that position. You also get the responsibility of any past wrongs that have not been addressed. And part of addressing past harms is recognizing what are those things that over time have manifested themselves in processes that still create harm. And I'll give you some examples of those in a little bit. But as we're talking through this, I was at a book reading from a woman who Karen Brannon is her name, and the name of the book was Family Tree. And she had moved to Washington, D.C., lived, raised just in the county south of us, started doing research. And what she found is that her grandfather, who was the sheriff, was responsible for facilitating lynchings. And as she began exploring that, she ended up interviewing a woman whose her grandfather had been responsible for lynching. And so she captured all that, and I was at that presentation, and I went up to her and I said, I'm dealing with this issue, trying to sort out, what would be the most effective way to deal with it, because it's easy for folks that aren't in the police department to say, well, this is past history, why are you messing with it? Well, when I got two little old ladies that are on the third floor pointing the pictures, that's a current event in their mind. That's not past history. And I asked her, I says, are you familiar with the police department that's dealt with this? So, I might have a model or something that I can look at. And she said, no, frankly, I'm not aware of one. And I look over and I see our NAACP president, and I just went over to him. And I've had a frisky relationship with him. I mean, they frequently come in, believing the police are wrong, and I frequently come into a meeting, believe the police are right. And so we have to reconcile both of those positions. But I went up to him and I said, Ernest, I'm thinking about doing something with the Austin Calloway lynching. Would that be something you'd be interested in working with? And he said, absolutely. And we recognized that if this was going to be successful, success defined as people accepting it for what it is, that it needed to be in a community initiative. And so we reached out to another group that I was unaware of that was studying lynchings locally. I think we had over a dozen. And reached out to the president of the college, reached out to state court judge, reached out to the pastor of the church where Austin was buried, reached out to the family of Austin Calloway. And all of them graciously joined us. And so as we're talking through what to do, it occurred to me, well, I hadn't talked to my officers about this. And, you know, like most police departments, you have your annual inspection where, you know, everybody lines up their cars, and we have take-home car programs, so I've got almost 100 cars, so trying to find a place where I can get 100 vehicles and get all the troops and make sure they got their equipment, their cars are maintained and all that stuff. I told the division commanders, I said, before we have inspection, I said, bring everybody together. I said, I just want to share something with them. And there's a little bit, kind of a mound that I can get on because I'm not a tall guy. And I said, you know, I've been working with the community on Austin Callaway lynching. You may or may not know about it, so I recited the history. I reminded him of Tuskegee. I reminded him of the Black Codes. I reminded him of Jim Crow. I reminded him of other lynchings. I reminded him of Mississippi appendectomies, where, you know, black women would go in for some sort of medical condition, and the doctor would claim that they needed their appendix out and would actually perform a non-consensual sterilization. So I reminded him all that history, our slave population. And I said, this is what I'm looking to do. If anybody's got a problem with it, I said, I'm not so far into this that I can't go another direction, but it needs to be addressed. So I'm open to any alternatives if y'all have any. Now, I don't know how many chiefs are in here, but when chiefs address the troops and then ask for feedback, you know, it's like being in a morgue. So, you know, nothing. So I said, well, then I'm assuming, absent any comment, then that you are embracing this effort. And although I may not know what's in your heart, I will know what comes out of your mouth, so I expect that you'll support it. And to their credit, as I was leaving, I probably got a half a dozen texts, because that's the way they talk to you now. I got about a half a dozen texts from officers saying, you know, you're doing the right thing. I expected that, you know, we would get some, you know, local media, but I never realized that it would get the kind of coverage and support internationally that it did. And I think I can characterize the reason for that because of the national and, sadly, in some states, statewide political environment that we're living in, that people are just so frustrated about no problem solving, nobody stepping up, nobody addressing issues. It's just spitting venom at each other. And so we had the apology and the acknowledgement. Probably a half a dozen of us spoke, less than an hour. And that's the first step. Because what is important is what follows after the acknowledgement of past harms. And I received probably close to 200 letters and emails from around the world. 9 were negative, none from incumbent officers. I got a couple from some retired dudes that, you know, told me I'd, you know, thrown our profession under the bus, yada, yada, yada. But from serving officers, 20, 30 years, including some from New York, that said that this is long overdue. Because those of us that are out on the street, those of us that deal with marginalized communities, we feel that frustration every day. And as police leaders, I think we have to be deliberate about processes that maybe have unintentionally developed in our institutions over time, where we just accept it as the way we do business. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is open container and taking somebody to jail for open container. You arrest, you know, somebody that's, you know, has a little bit of discretionary money for open container. By the time you get to jail, they've what? Posted a bond. You arrest somebody that's poor, and disproportionately marginalized communities are our poor communities, and you arrest them on a Friday night. They got a job on Saturday, but they're in jail until Monday, when the judge does what? What's the judge do on Monday with an open container? OR. So they've sat in jail for the weekend over something we know they're going to be OR'd for, and now they've lost their job. So enforcing some humbug law in that way, not that we shouldn't enforce it, but we recognize that we got a whole slew of those. So had a team of officers and supervisors go through, based on their experience, when you show up for court, how many of these get OR'd? And we identified probably several dozen, took them to the judge and said, we'd like these changed to no bond required unless the officer, and then he has to justify it, believes that a bond is appropriate. Record restriction, many states have created the, because of the emphasis now on employment background checks, where it's unusual when you apply for a job today where you don't have to sign giving consent for a criminal history. And what happens is somebody's arrested, it's not prosecuted, maybe it was a bad case, maybe they need the second, whatever it is. But the prospective employer gets it, and it goes on the stack where they don't even get an interview, get a chance to explain it. And so the legislature allows that to be restricted, but you got to go to the police, you got to go to the court clerk, you got to go to the prosecutor, you got to go to the judge, and all of those every one of those have fees. And so here's somebody with no money that's got to go through all these hoops. So we just called a meeting at the police department of all those parties and said, hey, if we act as the ombudsman, will you all waive fees? And they said yes. So the first record, we were the first police department in the state to do it. The first record restriction, we had 150 some. Second, 250. Fulton County, which is a million population, they had one, they had roughly 500. We're a population of 33,000, and we had 400. This is life-changing for people. And those are the kind of examinations I feel like, those of us in leadership positions, need to tackle. I'm very proud of our profession, just like people, because institutions are people. We should always be in a process of a little reflection and seeing if, by gosh, today if we can't do something a little better than we did yesterday and impact people's lives in ways that are life-changing. And we're in that rare career field that allows us to do that. Momentarily be in people's lives, but it be life-changing. I'll take a few questions if anybody has any. I don't think we have much time, but I seldom have an answer. I always have a response, so I'll be happy to respond to any. Yes, ma'am.
Great presentation. I was just wondering what was in you at that moment when you heard of the comment that the women said and you decided to act. There had to have been something in you that decided not to just dismiss it and go forward.
Well, I'm Catholic. If y'all are Catholic, you know the Catholic guilt. So, the nuns instilled that in me, and it's that little voice that, is always there. And so, I think your faith. I think, faith and knowing that, if something is required of you and you don't do it, there's errors of commission and omission, and that would be an error of omission, in my opinion. But I didn't address it. It was like 2.5, 3 years before I finally figured out a way to do it. It was just had to find the right combination, for the tumblers to be lined up. But yes, thank you, ma'am. Anyone else? All right. Well, I appreciate being invited here. Lagrange, about 40 miles north of us, is a city called Carrollton, and there was a poet that lived there. And about 15 years after the Civil War, he penned a poem. And the last couple of stanzas of that poem, I think, are challenges to anybody in a leadership position. And I think what he was trying to do is articulate the frustration that he had or saw the Civil War brought to the South and the failure of leadership to deal with slavery. If you look at the Civil War, more folks were killed in the Civil War than World War I and World War II combined. Mississippi, a year after the Civil War, spent 20% of their budget on artificial limbs. $1 out of 5 on artificial limbs. Anyway, the last couple of stanzas go, each of us are given a set of tools, a shapeless mass, and a book of rules. and each must make before life is flown stumbling blocks or stepping stones. Based on what I see around our country, I'm confident that our profession will continue creating stepping stones. For those that will follow, thank you for what you do, and thank you for creating those stepping stones.
Thank you, Chief Dekmar. Very timely and appropriate remarks for what we're doing here in New York, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us and share some of your experiences with us. We're going to take about a 15-minute break. There's coffee, etc. in the back. Take 15 minutes before our final formal session. So again, thank you, Chief Dekmar.